It wasn't supposed to become a routine. I had only planned to stay a few weeks, maybe a month, until I found a new apartment and pulled myself together. After the breakup, I didn't want to be around friends who pitied me or parents who'd ask questions I didn't want to answer. So I moved into the guest house behind his place. A quiet, detached setup my friend said would give me space and safety. I didn't expect him to be around much. I certainly didn't expect him to be the first person I saw every single morning. The first time I walked into the main house early in the day, it was because I couldn't sleep. It was still dark outside, and the air was cool enough to cling to my skin. I thought I'd sneak in, grab coffee, and sneak out. But he was already there, sitting at the kitchen table with a book, a steaming mug in hand. He looked up, startled for just a moment, then nodded politely. "You're up early," he said. "Couldn't sleep," I replied. He didn't push for more. Just nodded again and returned to his book. I made my coffee in silence and left. That could have been the end of it. But the next morning I found myself walking back in around the same time. Again he was there. Again we exchanged a quiet greeting. Again I made my coffee and left. But that time I sat down for a minute before going. And then it became a thing. I stopped pretending I was just passing through. He stopped pretending I wasn't sitting across from him each morning. There was something comforting about the silence we shared, like neither of us had the energy to pretend we weren't carrying things we didn't talk about. We didn't get into deep conversations at first. He'd mention the weather or the headlines. I'd nod, sometimes comment, sip my coffee. But the mornings kept coming, and so did we. Eventually, I found myself looking forward to those first few quiet minutes of the day. I began waking up earlier, setting my alarm so I wouldn't miss the window before he left for his morning walk. I'd hear the creak of the floorboards as I approached and know he was already there. He had a way of making the kitchen feel still, almost sacred, like time paused until we both stood up again. One morning he asked how I was sleeping, just like that, casually, without too much weight behind it. I shrugged and admitted the truth. Not well. He didn't offer advice or cliché comfort. He just said, "It takes time," and somehow that felt like enough. I learned that he liked his coffee black but occasionally added a splash of cream when he was feeling nostalgic. That he read the paper front to back, even the classifieds. That he always wore a watch but never looked at it. I started noticing how he'd listen fully before replying, how he never rushed to fill silences, how he spoke slowly but not out of hesitation, just intention. There was something steadying about him, something different from the men I'd known. He was older, obviously, but it wasn't about age. It was about presence. He was fully there in a way that made you feel safe without ever saying the words. And maybe that's what started to make the space between us feel different. I began to notice the little things. How he always poured a second mug when I entered, even before I asked. How he learned which side of the table I liked to sit on. How he would shift the newspaper so I could read the section I liked, without needing to ask. He wasn't trying to impress me, he was just paying attention. And that hit differently. We never talked about anything personal yet. Not directly. But the air between us started feeling heavier in a way I didn't want to admit. He never crossed a line. Not in his words. Not in his touch. But the familiarity, the way our routines braided together without planning, it started to live under my skin. I found myself brushing my hair before walking in, fixing my shirt, reapplying chapstick. Not because I wanted anything to happen, I told myself. Just because. I didn't want to look tired. That was all. He started offering me the first pour of coffee instead of the second. Tiny gesture, but I noticed. He'd wait until I sat down before unfolding the paper. I caught him glancing at me when he thought I wasn't looking. I didn't look away. I began to feel different when I was around him. Not giddy or reckless, just tuned in. Like the world slowed for a moment. Like I wasn't trying so hard to be someone else. I didn't need to laugh at his jokes or perform being okay. I just had to show up, and he would be there, steady as ever. Then came the morning I reached for the mug at the same time he did. Our fingers touched, just barely, and instead of pulling away, we both froze. Not long. Maybe a second, two at most. But the warmth of his skin stayed on mine even after he let go. He looked at me then, really looked. I held his gaze. It didn't feel like a mistake. It didn't feel like anything other than honest. But neither of us said a word about it. He handed me the mug without a sound, and I took it with a quiet thank you. My heart beat louder than I wanted. I sat down, sipped slowly, eyes fixed on the window, pretending nothing happened. But it had. And the air between us wasn't the same. When I got up to leave that morning, I didn't look back. But I knew. He was still sitting there, finishing his coffee, maybe wondering the same thing I was. Why did that moment feel like the start of something neither of us had planned for? The mornings didn't stop after that. If anything, they became more deliberate. Neither of us acknowledged what had happened when our hands touched, but it lingered. Something had shifted, silently but permanently. The next morning, he greeted me with the same nod, the same mug, the same seat across from him. But now the air between us felt fuller. There was a weight to it. Not uncomfortable, just undeniable. Our conversations deepened. What began as surface-level talk slowly turned into confessions neither of us had planned. He asked about my past relationship, and I answered in pieces. How it ended, how tired I was of feeling like I had to chase someone just to be seen. He didn't offer sympathy. Just listened with an attention that made me feel like what I said mattered. Then he told me about his marriage, not bitterly, but with quiet resignation. He said they hadn't shared a real conversation in years. That she was still in the house but never really present. They lived in parallel like ghosts in the same room. I should have felt uncomfortable hearing that, but I didn't. Maybe because it was said without agenda. He wasn't venting or complaining. He was just telling the truth. And somehow that made me want to share more of mine. I told him how I used to wake up every morning with anxiety. How silence used to make me feel alone. He looked at me then and said softly, "Funny, I only started to enjoy silence when you started sharing it with me." I didn't know how to respond to that, so I didn't. I just smiled and took another sip of coffee. But his words stayed with me all day. I replayed them later when I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering if I was making something out of nothing. Except it didn't feel like nothing. The mornings grew longer. What used to be 10, maybe 15 minutes, stretched into 30, sometimes 40. Neither of us mentioned it. It was just how things unfolded. I noticed he started waiting for me before starting the coffee, like he didn't want to begin without me. I started brushing my teeth as soon as I woke up, skipping my scroll through notifications, just so I wouldn't miss him. Something about those mornings made the rest of the day feel manageable. One morning, I walked in to find he'd made breakfast. Just toast and eggs, nothing elaborate, but it was set on the table like it was normal. I raised an eyebrow. He simply said, "Thought we could use something more than caffeine today." I sat down, no words. But I smiled, and I let the moment wrap around us. We were orbiting something we refused to name. There was no flirting, no dramatic declarations. Just this consistent, quiet intimacy that neither of us seemed willing to break. But it was getting harder to ignore. The space between us grew smaller, our words more personal. He told me he liked the way I thought, that I saw things he hadn't considered. I told him he made me feel calm, and I didn't say that about many people. He nodded, eyes on his mug, and said, "I haven't felt calm around anyone in a long time." I started to wonder if he waited for these mornings the same way I did. If he noticed the exact moment I entered the room. If he felt the stillness when we sat together. I told myself it was harmless. We weren't doing anything wrong. But every day it got harder to believe that. Not because anything physical had happened, but because everything emotional already had. One day I woke up feeling off. Restless. I almost didn't go into the kitchen. I told myself I needed space, that this was becoming too much. But I went anyway. And he was there like always. He looked up and paused, then smiled in that small familiar way. He asked if I was okay, and I gave a non-answer. He didn't press. But after a few minutes of silence, he reached across the table, placed his hand over mine, and just left it there. No words. No explanation. I didn't pull away. It lasted only a few seconds before he let go and looked away, clearing his throat, pretending nothing happened. But my heartbeat told me something had. And this time there was no denying it. The rules we'd been pretending to follow didn't exist anymore. We were somewhere else entirely. That night I couldn't sleep again. I replayed the way his hand felt on mine, the way it didn't feel wrong. I thought about the fact that I hadn't touched someone in months, not like that, not with meaning. I wondered if he was lying awake too, if his thoughts were tangled with mine. I didn't want him. I didn't want this to be real. But it was, and pretending otherwise only made it worse. The next few mornings were quieter. Not cold, not distant, just heavier. Every word seemed chosen. Every glance stretched too long. We both knew we were standing on a line, and neither of us was stepping back. He started asking questions he hadn't asked before. About what I wanted out of life, what I feared, what I missed most. I answered honestly, maybe more than I should have. But he never judged. He just listened. One morning he said, "You bring something into this house I didn't know I missed." I looked at him, unsure of what to say. But my silence was its own answer. We both knew we'd gone too far to pretend it was casual anymore. The bond had become real. Not forced. Not fantasy. Just real. And real was far more dangerous. I told myself again that it was just mornings. Just coffee. Just company. But I didn't believe myself anymore. We had stopped being innocent the moment we started caring this much. I began to wonder what would happen if I left. If this connection would dissolve or haunt us. I didn't have an answer. But I also wasn't ready to walk away. Not yet. Not while every morning still felt like the only part of my life that made sense. I woke up before the alarm that morning. Something felt different. The house was completely still, darker than usual, the kind of quiet that makes you slow your steps without meaning to. Rain tapped against the windows in a steady rhythm, and there was no hum of electricity. Power was out. For a moment I considered staying in bed. But the habit had already taken over. My body moved before my mind could resist. When I entered the kitchen, he was already there. No overhead light, just a flickering candle on the table and the glow of the overcast sky behind him. He looked up as I stepped in, his face unreadable, but there was something about the way his eyes stayed on mine that made me feel like this morning was going to be different. There was no newspaper in front of him. No mug. Just stillness. I joined him quietly. Neither of us spoke for the first few minutes. The silence wasn't awkward, it was heavy, like we were both carrying something too big to set down. He poured me coffee from a small pot he'd heated over the gas stove. I took it without a word. My hands brushed his again. This time he didn't flinch. I didn't move either. Eventually he broke the silence. He said he hadn't slept much. That the storm reminded him of nights when he used to lie awake next to someone who felt like a stranger. He said it plainly, without bitterness. I asked if he ever thought about leaving. He said he had more than once. But life gets complicated. There are things you stay for, even when you're no longer in them. His voice was calm, but every word felt like it carried years of quiet suffering. Then he asked about me. About why I never talked about the person I left. I told him it was because that relationship made me feel like I was constantly negotiating my worth. I said I stayed too long because I was afraid to be alone. He nodded slowly, like he understood too well. Then he said, "You don't seem afraid anymore." And I didn't answer because he was right. We sat in silence again. Only this time it didn't feel like we were waiting for anything. I looked at him and he looked back. There was no hesitation. No rush. Just this moment that we'd both somehow known was coming. And then it happened. He leaned in, slowly, like he was giving me every second to stop him. I didn't. When his lips touched mine, it wasn't urgent or reckless. It was careful, almost reverent. His hand came up to my cheek, and I let it. The kiss didn't feel like crossing a line. It felt like arriving at something we'd been circling for too long. When we pulled apart, neither of us spoke. There was no apology, no explanation. Just breath between us. He stood up and walked to the window. I stayed seated, heart pounding in a way that wasn't anxious. Just overwhelmed. I didn't know what to say, so I didn't say anything. But my body felt different, like something in me had finally been acknowledged after being buried for too long. He turned back and asked if I was okay. I said yes, even though I didn't know what okay meant anymore. We didn't touch again that morning, but something had changed permanently. There was no pretending we could go back. The boundary we'd respected without speaking was gone. Later that day, I tried to convince myself it didn't matter. That it was one mistake, a moment created by storm and silence and proximity. But deep down I knew better. What happened wasn't impulsive. It was deliberate, even if we hadn't planned it. I kept thinking about the way he looked at me after, not like he was regretting it, but like he finally saw something clearly. The next morning, I wasn't sure what I'd find. Part of me expected distance, awkwardness, maybe avoidance. But when I walked into the kitchen, he was there. The lights were back on. The coffee was made. And my mug was waiting for me just like always. He didn't act like anything had changed, but I could feel it in every glance, every silence that followed a sentence. I sat across from him like I always did, but my chest felt tight, full of questions I didn't know how to ask. Was this a beginning or a mistake we were pretending didn't happen? I asked him finally what it meant. He didn't answer right away. Then he said, "It means we stopped pretending." That was it. No promises. No justifications. Just truth. I nodded because I understood. We hadn't fallen into anything. We'd chosen it. Quietly, steadily, over morning after morning. Until one day it simply became too much to hold back. It wasn't passion or loneliness or weakness. It was something slower. Something real. Something that felt like belonging, even if we didn't know what to do with it. I didn't ask what came next. I didn't ask if he'd leave her or if I should leave the guest house. We weren't talking about logistics. We were just trying to breathe in the space we'd made. I knew we couldn't stay suspended like this forever. I knew there were consequences waiting. But that morning I didn't care. I only cared that for once, nothing between us was imagined. It had happened. And neither of us wished it hadn't. We didn't talk about that morning again. Not once. But we never needed to. It was there, in the way he started pouring my coffee before I walked in. In how he no longer waited for me to sit before handing me my mug. In the way his eyes held mine longer, not searching, just settled. Something between us had quieted. Not disappeared, but stopped asking for permission. We kept showing up every morning the same way we always had. But everything had changed. There was no shift in routine, no dramatic behavior. But now when I sat down, his knee touched mine. When I spoke, his eyes stayed on me a second longer. I didn't pull away. I stopped calculating whether a gesture meant something or if it didn't. I stopped pretending I didn't need the mornings. I had built a life around them. I didn't care how small that sounded. He never made promises. I never asked for them. I didn't need to hear what I already knew. We had slipped into something that existed outside of names, rules, and expectations. It wasn't a relationship, and it wasn't casual. It was a bond built on timing and silence, and everything we didn't say out loud. He still lived in the same house with someone else, but he never spoke of her again. I never asked. Not out of fear, but because I knew it wouldn't change what we were. We weren't hiding from the world. We were just preserving what the world wouldn't understand. Sometimes, in the middle of a sentence, he'd reach for my hand. Not for effect. Just for grounding. Let him. Sometimes I'd lean my head against the chair back and let my shoulder fall toward him. He never pulled away. We stayed like that for minutes. Not touching in any scandalous way. Just close enough to feel like the chaos outside couldn't reach us. I wondered if anyone noticed. If the staff who came by occasionally felt the undercurrent between us. If the silence in the room had a shape they could sense. Maybe they did. But no one said anything. And honestly, we wouldn't have cared if they did. The strangest part was how natural it felt. Not right in a moral sense. Not easy. Just honest. It wasn't about need or escape. It was about comfort. He became my pause. I became his softness. We were two people in the middle of life's unfinished business, finding something simple and still and human in each other. We didn't spend nights together. There were no secret phone calls or locked doors. Just the same room, same table, same time every morning. The world spun outside of that window, but inside, it felt like nothing moved except the steam off our coffee mugs. Sometimes I'd wake up and think about leaving. About cutting it off before it unraveled or hurt someone else. But then I'd walk in and see him there, waiting, and I'd sit down without a word. And just like that, every reason I had to walk away would dissolve. I didn't feel shame. I didn't feel proud either. What I felt was peace, something I hadn't had in years. Not excitement or lust or fantasy. Just peace. In a world that asked so much of me. He asked for nothing but presence. He started using words like ours when he referred to our mornings. Did you want to read our section? I saved the last of our beans. It wasn't possession. It was acknowledgement. Quiet way of saying this space belongs to both of us, and no one else. Some mornings we didn't speak at all. We'd sit in silence, looking at nothing in particular. I never questioned if it meant he was pulling away. I knew better. There was something in the quiet that said more than words ever could. There were moments when I felt a flicker of panic, like I was wasting time building something that had no future. But every time I looked at him, that panic slipped away. Because whatever this was, it didn't ask for forever. It only asked for now. And now was all I could handle. One morning, he reached across the table and touched my wrist. He didn't say anything. He just stayed like that for a while, thumb resting lightly against my skin, like he was memorizing the feel of me. I didn't ask why. I didn't ask what came next. I just closed my eyes and let it be enough. I began to understand that some stories don't need endings. That not everything has to be sorted, labeled, or explained. That not every connection leads to a future. Some are just meant to be felt exactly as they are for as long as they last. He never said he loved me. I never said it either. But sometimes when I'd laugh at something quietly to myself, I'd catch him watching me like I was the only thing in the room. And I knew that whatever word we didn't speak, it was already living between us. I stopped wondering what people would think. I stopped feeling the need to justify what we were doing. Because I knew what I felt when I was with him. I knew the mornings were no longer ordinary. They were sacred. Not because of what happened between us, but because of what didn't need to. Now every day begins the same way. I wake up, brush my hair, pour a glass of water. I walk through the rain or the sun or the cold and open the same door. And there he is, always there. Coffee waiting. That small, familiar smile that says nothing but means everything. And every morning our hands brush as I take the mug. And every morning I let my fingers stay a second longer. He never pulls away.